So we want to add some basic functionality to the UObject that we created in the previous video and basically continue our discussion on objects. So again, under C++ classes, C++ experiments, so here is that object, my object that we created, the C++ class. So if you don't have Visual Studio open, you can go to File and open Visual Studio. Now in the content browser, you can right-click on whichever C++ class it is that you want to edit. So in this case, we have these two, and then I want to edit my object. So I'll right-click on that, and I'll click Edit, and this will open up Visual Studio again. I'll go to myObject.h. Basically what we want to do is eventually we want to use this somewhere in blueprints, and we want to give it a function that we can call, and the goal with the function will be to print something out to the log in Unreal Engine. So just like with a normal C++ class, you can do a constructor. So what I'll do is I'll do the constructor, and I'll do a void function called hello. Now I would like to bring up the documentation. This is on properties. Okay, and here you can see integers, for example. You can see the convention for integral types is int or uint for unsigned integers, followed by the size in bits. Here you can see uint8, an 8-bit unsigned integer. You also have normal, like signed integers, of course. If you scroll down, you have floating point types. Now Unreal uses the standard C++ floating point types, float and double. Then you can also see here the Boolean types. What's useful about the documentation is you can see the naming conventions as well. So here you can see they use camel case, okay, and they start with a capital, and that's true for functions as well. But in this case, like when you have a B in the front or something like that for bool, then that will start with a lowercase, okay? So B, lowercase b for Boolean, and then you have E is thirsty. So things like that to take into consideration to try and conform to the conventions. So in this case, I want health, so for some character maybe, and we are only concerned with a health of 0 to, let's say, 100. 0 means the character is dead, of course, and 100 means you are at full health. So I'll do uint8, and I'll call this health. Okay, here we get this green line that says the definition for hello not found. I'll right click on that, go to quick actions, and here we can create definition of that function in myObject.cpp. So in the cpp file, I'll left click on that to do that, and you get this preview. I'll close out of that and go to the cpp file, myObject.cpp, and here you can see it went in and defined this for us. I'll get back to this in a second. You can of course also type this stuff out. So my object, so in the constructor here, I want to initialize the health. Of course, we want our character to start with full health. The integer type here will depend again on the range of values that you need and so on. Okay, as we discussed in the C++ course. So going back to the CPP file here, we want to print something out to the screen. I'll just save all here for a second, make sure my stuff is saved, and we can use the macro UE underscore log to log stuff out, and this takes a few parameters. And so what we do here is log temp warning, and then we do the text macro. We close that off. Okay, so here we have a category temp here, and then this will basically determine the color that will show up. So in this case, this will give us a yellow color. Okay, this message will show up in a yellow color in the log. And this is another macro that we use for the actual text that we want to print out. So I don't want to spend too much time on this log or logging in Unreal Engine in this video. We'll come back to that. I'll do a sidebar, a video on logging, because there is kind of quite a few things that revolve around this. And again, we'll use this more and more as we go throughout the course. But this is the basic thing that you need to print stuff out to the screen. Okay, if you want to print out just a simple line of text, this is how you would start with that. So I'll save all. And what I'll do next is I'll go back into the header. Okay, so next I want to recap again the macros that we get. So UProperty and UFunction. I'll bring up the documentation here quickly again. So for properties, you have the UProperty and then a few specifiers, okay, and the variable name. So you use again standard C++ syntax, but then you use the UProperty macro, which defines property metadata and variable specifiers. Now, what is metadata? Well, metadata is data about data. What are the specifiers? Well, if I go to the property specifiers, you can see you have a bunch of these. You have blueprint, read only, and you have a bunch of these that we'll talk about as we go along. Okay, so add those in here. So let's just go in and we will add UProperty, and here we will do UFunction. Okay, and then for the specifiers, so for the property, I'll do blueprint read only. So here you can see blueprint read only can be read by blueprints, but not modified. Okay, so I'll do that. Blueprint read only. And for UFunction here, I'll do blueprint callable. And this means that we can call this function from blueprints, which is exactly what we want to do. Okay, I'll save all. Now, another thing I'd like to note before I compile, bring back the project, is if I right click on this, you see that we cannot create a blueprint class based on this. Okay, sometimes we want to go in and create a blueprint or multiple blueprint classes from a C++ base, so that we can then extend on top of that. So we implement the base functionality in C++ and then we build functionality on top of that. Okay, so but in this case we cannot do that. And this is because we need to specify this U class as blueprintable. Again, you have a bunch of specifiers that can go in here, but for our purposes for right now, for this video, and for the UObject section, we are mainly concerned with blueprintable. So this will mean that we can create blueprints or use, this C++ class as a base to create blueprints from. So with that, I'll save all. I'll open Unreal Editor and you can compile right here. We actually get an error. It says blueprint read only should not be used on private members. Okay, so I'm back in Visual Studio. I'd like to note that previous output log that we saw with the compilation results in Unreal Engine, and that is very useful. You might want to even dock that somewhere if you want. But for now, I'll just continue here in Visual Studio. So of course we want to make these public. So your constructor and your properties and so on, again, will get an error if something that is blueprint read only or read write is not public. And of course our constructor we want to be public. So this is standard C++ stuff. Those squiggly should go away, yeah. So there are a few ways of building our project or compiling. So we've seen this briefly in the previous video as well. So you can right click on your project and click build, or what you can do is you can bring up the editor again and you can click this compile button. Now as soon as you click this compile button, a small pop-up will show up. You'll get a funny noise and that will show compiling. And once it's finished compiling, then it will show you that basically, right, whether it is successful or not. So let's just click compile here and you'll see what happens. Compiling C++ code. And as soon as that's done, we should be able to create compile complete. Okay, we don't have any errors. And we should now be able to create a blueprint class based on UObject. Cool, another thing is, I'll bring up Visual Studio here. Okay, so as I mentioned, you can right click on a project and click build. What you can also do is you can click this drop down, add remove buttons. If you want maybe a shortcut to that, you can do customize in the commands section. And I have toolbar selected to text editor. I can do add command, go to build, and then you can do maybe build selection or build solution. I'll select build selection here, click OK. And now I can move this down. You can see it reposition as you click those buttons, so move up, move down. So maybe right there is fine for me, and I'll click close. So now what I can do is I can make a change. I'll just cut this out quickly, and then I'll click build. So in this case, it's going to build that C++ experiments. It'll show you what it'll build. Okay, if you hover over it, it will say build CPP experiments. It also shows you hotkey, so you can press Ctrl B, just a quicker way than having to go and right click and click build. Just click that or press Ctrl B. Okay, another hotkey for you. Of course, if you go to Unreal Engine 4, you go to source and developer or editor, maybe something like that, and you go to maybe public or private, one of these, open a header maybe. You select that, then this will be the selected project because we are currently editing this header file which is in that project. Okay, so I'll just close that off. We are not concerned with that, with the engine. We are concerned here with our CPP experiments project. Okay, so I cut that out, of course. I'll paste that back, and as I mentioned, we can right click on the project, click build, and I'll open up Unreal Editor here. And when that is finished, you should get a pop-up that says hot reload complete or something like that. You'll get a noise. You can see hot reload complete. Okay, so what is this hot reload? It's a feature that allows the Unreal Editor to detect newly compiled DLLs automatically, and it will then reload the DLL as soon as the project is compiled. The problem here is that it's not 100% reliable. It has become more reliable over time, but it's still not 100%. In some cases, you'll need to close the Unreal Editor, then build your new code, and then reopen the Unreal Editor again before you'll see some changes take effect. And this is simply something that you have to get used to kind of as you go along, and we'll probably see a few of these cases as we go along throughout the course. With experience, you'll know like when you should close the editor first, then compile and then open it up again. Okay, so these are things that you'll kind of pick up with time. So just a few more notes before we move on. I'm going to close off the editor here. And so back in Visual Studio, what I almost forgot to mention was you can right click. So if you right click in here somewhere, okay, in this bar, get this drop down with the various groupings of tools basically that you get, okay? So if you toggle these on and off, you can see that you get your standard things. So things for saving and your build configuration and stuff like that. So what we can also add is build. So if you add that, you get these tools. So you can build the current thing again, just like what you can do with Ctrl B, or you can build the solution. Okay, so that's another shortcut. Of course, you can go to build and then you can build the current thing right here. Again, Ctrl B, the shortcut, or build solution. Then let's say, as I mentioned, in some cases you probably want to close the editor down write a chunk of code and then open the editor again, right? Now to do that, you don't have to go into the launcher or use the shortcut on your desktop. What you can do is you can go to debug and then start without debugging. So just like when you run your console applications, basically, you can do that here, start without debugging. As soon as I do, that will go and build the project. So it's going to save whatever changes you made, as you can see, and then it's going to build. Once it is finished building, it will now start your project up. So here I have the project open again. So many ways of accessing these shortcuts. Of course, launching here local Windows debugger, that will also launch the editor. And in that case, Visual Studio will be in debug mode, basically. Now we'll probably talk about debugging in more detail later. Now another important thing I would like to mention is the configurations. Now the solution platforms, you can leave that at Win64. Now I want to talk about the configuration in a bit more detail, but we can leave it at development editor. Okay. And you might note that you won't see all of these if you only have like a single file open or something like that. You have to open the solution. Now for this, I'd like to open up the documentation again. So we talked about the Unreal Build tool previously. So it says here Unreal Engine 4 uses a custom building method via the Unreal Build tool. Now the tool processes the information necessary to build the engine's reflection system, integrating your C++ code with blueprints, replication, serialization, and garbage collection. Now every build configuration contains two keywords. I'll just bring Visual Studio up again. We have development editor currently. Okay, so that's two keywords. And the first keyword indicates the state of the engine and your game project. So for example, if you compile using the debug configuration, you'll be able to debug your game's code. And the second keyword indicates the target you are building for. So for example, if you want to open a project in Unreal, so the Unreal editor, then you need to build with the editor target keyword. Here you can see the state. So we chose development. Okay, so this is used by default. And compiling your project using the development configuration enables you to see the code changes made to your project reflected in the editor. Then we chose editor for that target. Okay, the second keyword, we chose editor to be able to open the project in Unreal Editor and to see all the code changes reflected. The project must be built in an editor configuration. So I have a bunch of other stuff here. So you have empty, for example. So this configuration builds a standalone executable version of your project. And we'll talk about this kind of stuff later. Okay, packaging up basically your project. So I just wanted to mention this stuff here and why we use that configuration. Again, development editor. Okay, so that's a quick introduction to that. What we can do now is we can right click on this, my object class, and then create blueprint class based on my object. So I'll select that and you can see that we can now name it and so on. Another thing you can do is I'll go up to content, right click, and in this case I want a new folder. And I'll call that blueprints. Double click on that. Now I'll right click in here and I'll create a blueprint class. From here we can select like what do we inherit from or what do we choose kind of the base class. So I'll click all classes and then I'll search my object. Okay, click that and I'll select that and you can see that's really quick to do. And now we can name this. And you can name it something like my object again, but I'll do underscore BP right at the end, so postfix, to show that this is the blueprint version of that. Because as you can see, this has that O as well for object, and that's the same thing here, but the colors are different thankfully. So this one is kind of this gray color and the blueprint is blue, of course. So you can double click on this to open it up and dock that to the side there maybe. I'll just like to go back for a second to the C++ class, right click on this, create blueprint class based on my object. Now, if you remember, this did not show up previously, so because of this in Visual Studio, this blueprintable, again, because of that, we can create a blueprint based on this C++ class and then extend that, use what variables and whatever we added in C++ and do something with that in blueprints. So if I click this, again, you can name it and then click the folder and then you can create that blueprint class. Okay, so a couple of ways basically of doing the same thing, to go in and create a blueprint and save it. And now you see that asterisk goes away, that we also had in the content browser, that asterisk. And you can also save all. Now what we can do is we can right click in this graph, the event graph, go down to variables, and under my object we see get health. So if I'll click on that, we can get the health that way and then we can use it. We can also set the health, but currently we can't do that because I'll bring up Visual Studio again, because this is blueprint read only, right? So if I do blueprint read write, and I'll just build that again. Again, you have that hotkey. Go back in the editor. Hot reload complete. So we can right click now. Again, if you go to variables down here, my object, you can now also set the health from blueprints. So we can both get and set that now. Of course, you need some kind of an event like begin play or whatever the case might be. You set the health to some value. If you remember, in Visual Studio, we also have this function here called hello, and we can call this from blueprints. So if I search for that, you'll see this shows up. So we can call this from blueprints. And when we do this here in the source file, this text here should print out to the log. Go in the window and I'll bring up the developer tools and the output log. So you can clear the log by right clicking and then simply selecting clear log. Okay, next in the class viewer, I mentioned this class viewer previously. So I mentioned that you can go and right click on the class, then create a blueprint class based on that object. I can do similar stuff in the class viewer. So turn off that filter and then I'll do my object. So in this case, you see we actually have the blueprint as well. So this is a fast way of filtering what you have available. Right click on here. Now I can create a blueprint class based on that. Okay, similar to how we could previously. I'll just cancel this. Or you can create or edit based on the blueprint. What's useful is we can also do from actor, for example. So you can create a blueprint class from that, or C++ class. You can open the source code, as well as things like the game mode. Okay, so the game mode basically defines the game that is being played. So it's rules and scoring, for example. We'll discuss the game mode in more detail later. So you can right click on this and create a blueprint class from that and so on. So not just the classes that we wrote in C++, the objects or actors or whatever, or the blueprints that we have, but also like the general classes and stuff that you have available. You can search in here and you can go and create based off of that. All right, so a couple of ways of basically doing the same thing, because of course you can do file, new C++ class, and then show all classes, and here you get a lot of those same classes. So you can do game mode, as you can see, it's right here, and you can do my object is in here now as well, so you can actually inherit from that and stuff like that. Okay, so you get the idea, multiple ways of basically doing the same thing. Okay, we have a lot more to talk about with regards to UObjects. We still have to learn like how do we instantiate and use them. So we'll continue this discussion in the next video.